there's no bias in it, and that it is all divisible. So if I understand how the component parts of a larger phenomenon work, then I can understand the phenomenon. And it is constant. It never changes. So, the way an airplane flies today is the way an airplane flew 30 years ago, and it's the way it's going to fly 30 years from now. So when we have approached foreign language education, I think what we have done historically, or at least in my lifetime, is approached it from the standpoint of logical positivism. If we can figure out how languages are acquired, and we can isolate the different sub-steps, if you will, or steps to language acquisition, then we can control the circumstances that we need to control so that students can learn language. And I think that that's problematic. I think that for our field, it has some validity, but it's also very, very misplaced in other ways. So let me talk about the validity first. So I think physiologically, it's correct. The way in which language is produced by all human beings across the planet physiologically, I think, is a natural phenomenon. I think can be broken down into component steps, and I think we can understand that. So, an airstream comes from the lungs. It's modified by all the various points of articulation, and then you get these sounds that are discrete sounds that we combine to make words and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. Again, physiologically, I think logical positivism makes a lot of sense. The problem that foreign language ed has is the same problem that education has, which is that once we try and come up with the grand formula for learning, we begin to really trip up on this, because one of the other ways in which we approach epistemology or knowledge is we look at, sometimes it's called naturalism, interpretivism, but the idea is that every human being encounters truth differently, and just because something is true for you doesn't make it true for me. And this one is not without its problems, but let me walk you through this. If you feel like that, let's say you and I go into a bank or something, and let's say that I feel like the teller discriminated against us, and you feel like they didn't. And I have a weapon. Okay, let's make this a really gory story. I have a weapon, and I end up shooting somebody in the bank because in my version of truth, they did discriminate against me, and I'm clearly got some problems if I'm going to shoot somebody for that, right? So let's not make it me. Let's make it somebody else. So if the person shoots somebody because they believe they were discriminated against, and you don't shoot somebody because you don't believe you were discriminated against, the truth of whether you were discriminated against is really irrelevant. What's relevant is that the actions were taken by one person in my little bank robbery scene here were based on their version of reality. And so truth is constructed by each individual differently. And truth being constructed by each individual differently leads to different outcomes based not on whether or not you were discriminated against or not, but whether or not the person perceives that they were discriminated against. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So moving forward a step more. When we begin looking at epistemology a third way, and this is what I tend to talk about critical theory as, is that we start to look at the fact that knowledge is based on power relationships. And again, this is so far away from what foreign language educators back in the 1990s were taught that it's really hard to understand. So, here's an example that language teachers usually will relate to. When we take a look at a dictionary either prescribes the way a language is used, or it describes the way a language is used. The question is, who owns the language? If the language is owned by academics, then we can claim authority to prescribe, if we write the dictionary, we can claim authority to prescribe the way language is used. But if language is owned by the native speakers of that language, or even the non-native speakers, then all a dictionary really does is describe how we use our language. And so when you start getting into those kinds of questions, you start to realize that even things like grammar, even things like, conjugation or vocabulary or things like that are decided power struggle, because the question is, well, what is your language other than English?
Spanish.
Okay, so you can help me out with this because I never can remember it. But there's autobus in Spain, and there's something in Puerto Rico. It's like Wawa or something like that.
Yeah, Wawa.
Yeah, and so which is the word? Well, the which depends upon the sociological context in which you are speaking. If you are speaking in an academic environment in Puerto Rico that's an international conference, which one would you use? I don't know. I'm just taking a shot that you'd use the autobus one, right? But my point being that those contexts are have great impact on things as simple as vocabulary and grammar choices. One other example that I often use when I'm describing this is, so people say, yeah, but math isn't power-based. 2 plus 2 is 4. I don't care what culture you're in. And I say, well, that's interesting, because 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true. But when you write that, you are assuming a base 10 system. So you're assuming that the number 2 represents 2 in a base 10 system. Whereas you could write it as 1 plus 1 in a base, I don't forget what I did when I do this example, but like a base 2 system. In other words, we are assuming that we all have agreed upon our symbol system as meaning certain things. And again, that's based on a power relationship. That's based on the fact that somebody in school told us that we will always use this system when we are writing 2 plus 2 equals 4. But there's no neutral or natural reason we did that. It's all because we were taught that way in school. All right, so what do we need to do in terms of moving the field? So what we have to do is we have to recognize that, yes, there is a role for logical positivism in language study, and that is that physiologically we produce language the same way regardless of who we are. But sociologically, language is shaped by the context in which it is used, and those contexts are constant sites of struggle, and they're constant sites of contest. And so what we as foreign language teachers have to understand is that we cannot continue to present those other parts of language as being neutrally and naturally defined. So in a French class, just because the Académie Française, or whatever it's called, says this is the proper language use, doesn't make it the proper language use. It makes it one claim, and what we need to do as language teachers is provide counterclaims. And that, to me, is the